Hey everybody, it's Mike Gallagher. We just had 2 days of intense hearings on Afghanistan, first in the Senate Armed Services Committee, and then yesterday in the House Armed Services Committee, of which I'm a member with the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, as well as the Commander of Central Command, which is the Middle East and Afghanistan, Frank Mckenzie. And these hearings focused on a lot of different topics. Members went in a lot of different directions. I think there were a lot of concerns expressed, a lot of emotions exchanged. And I just wanted to share, and you only get 5 minutes in these things, and it's really hard to cover a lot of ground, particularly when there's back and forth in 5 minutes. I wanted to share what I think were some big takeaways from the thing, because this is going to be the first part of a broader effort to get answers from the executive branch on Afghanistan. I think a lot of us think this is one of the biggest foreign policy failures we've seen in recent history. We have unanswered questions about the nature of that failure, the quality of information we were getting, some of the, I think, outright deception we were getting from the White House at times, characterizing the information, and there needs to be a much more thorough investigation, particularly in light of the fact that we left hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans behind enemy lines, and also saw the tragic but preventable death, I believe, of 13 American service members, as well as the tragic and preventable death of 10 Afghan civilians, including 7 children. So a lot of different things were covered, but for me, there were at least 3 things that stood out that I think are worthy of broader investigation. The first, there was this, Bob Woodward and Robert Costa published a book, which General Milley admits he was a source for. He sat on background for an interview with Bob Woodward for the book. That caused a lot of concern among myself and other Republicans. And it seemed as though General Milley did not think at all that he did anything inappropriate in talking to Bob Woodward for this book, talking about sort of the events surrounding January 6th. And I did not think that was appropriate. And I was struck by what I think is a contradiction. At one point in the Senate hearing, Senator Tom Cotton asked him, why didn't you, if you had recommended to the president that we're going to stay in Afghanistan, he rejected that advice. If you had concerns, I'm paraphrasing, why didn't you resign? Why didn't you make a point? And given the fact that you're now saying, Al-Qaeda could reemerge, et cetera, why did no one put their rank on the table and resign? I think that's a fair question. And Milley responded quite forcefully and effectively said if he had resigned, it would have politicized his job and the position. And you don't want general officers resigning every time they disagree with policy because, of course, they're not policymakers. They simply execute the policy. And as long as it's not an unlawful order, they need to execute it. So all fine, I guess. And I certainly share the desire not to politicize the position. But to me, what doesn't add up is if you're so concerned about politicizing this position, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the principal military advisor to the president, then why did you sit for interviews with almost every journalist who's writing a memoir about the last days of the Trump administration in what appears to be an effort to make yourself look good? I think that politicizes the job more than anything else. And the concern it creates is that any future president sitting across the table at the National Security Council from a future chairman of the Joint Chiefs is going to be thinking, well, this guy's going to talk to a journalist. There's going to be a almost contemporaneous account of this conversation, and that degrades the quality of advice that the president gets from his chief military advisor. So I would submit that talking to Bob Woodward or all these other journalists, particularly on background, if you're going to talk on the record, right? As if you were at a press conference answering questions, as general officers are often forced to do, right? That's sort of a unique thing that we ask our general officers to do, is to engage with Congress and the press. I got that. But by doing this on background and being a source for these books and leaking stuff via legacy media, that itself politicizes the position. And that's why I was discouraged to see that General Milley didn't think there was anything inappropriate with him talking to the press, and anything inappropriate with his conversations with his Chinese counterparts. And I think that does warrant further investigation by Congress. The second thing I said, over the horizon, OTH, over the horizon, you saw a lot of bipartisan concern, I think, expressed about what is now our counterterrorism strategy in Afghanistan, which is to do this over the horizon counterterrorism, which I take to mean we're going to conduct missions that don't originate from the actual country of Afghanistan. And the reason this is problematic, well, there are many reasons, right? In order to develop a target, you need intelligence on the ground. And in many cases, you can't just rely on signals intelligence, you need human intelligence from sources on the ground. And now that we are no longer there, our ability to collect and analyze and process intelligence has been degraded. The second problem is we don't have basing agreements with countries surrounding Afghanistan. And when questioned, General Mckenzie suggested that, he said that, well, our friends are letting us conduct these operations. Well, the question he needs to be asked, and I didn't have enough time to ask, is how confident are you in Pakistan's willingness to allow us to conduct flights over their airspace going forward? Without basing agreements nearby, you're really limited in what you can do. And then, of course, you have much less time on target, right? If you're flying a drone from the Arabian Gulf or Qatar, the amount of time it takes to get to Afghanistan is immense. And so your ability to hover over a target is severely degraded. And then add on to that the fact that you're now forcing a lot of naval assets that should be focused on China and the Pacific to cover down on this over-the-horizon counterterrorism mission in Afghanistan. And then I think we've seen the tragic results and risks of over-the-horizon counterterrorism with the strike that killed seven innocent children and 10 innocent civilians overall in Afghanistan. And so I think we're going to have to do a lot more questioning of the executive branch on the assumptions underlying over-the-horizon counterterrorism. And my concern, quite honestly, is that this is just a fancy phrase that we're using to justify the fact that we surrendered. We cut and run, we surrendered, and now we're putting all our eggs in the basket of an over-the-horizon counterterrorism capability that has severe, severe limits. And that leads to the following thing, and I do think this is the area where DOD deserves a lot of hard questions and follow-ups, because what I saw was this attempt by all three of the generals that were there. Austin's a retired four-star general. He's now Secretary of Defense. To basically say two things. One is that because of the political constraints that were put on us, we didn't have any other options, right? We couldn't have kept Bagram. We had to just focus on the airport. Eventually, we couldn't secure the embassy. We could only focus on the airport because Biden made the decision to withdraw and to reduce troops to a certain number. And I understand part of that, right? There's no question. And Milley called this a strategic failure, but a logistical success. A strategic failure, but a logistical success. So in other words, the strategic decision was Biden's, and it was a bad decision, and it's a failure, right? Our surrender in Afghanistan, which General Mckenzie refused to call a conditional surrender, and I pressed him on this, and he said, no, it's a non-combatant evacuation. It might have been a withdrawal. I don't remember what my order said but it was a conditional surrender to the Afghanistan. They're basically saying, well, the political decision was made, and we executed the decision, and we executed it well, right? That's what I sense is what they're saying. Well, there's at least two problems with that. It implies that there were no options along the way. But as I questioned General Mckenzie, at one point, the Taliban leader, Mullah Baradar, came to him in Qatar in a meeting in Doha and said, well, who's going to be in charge of Kabul? We don't necessarily want to take Kabul right now. Do you guys want to secure all of Kabul as opposed to just the airport? And so you have the Taliban making us an offer that we can actually secure the whole city as we get our people out. And Mckenzie basically said to me that he did not think that was a realistic offer, both because of the troops we had on the ground, and therefore he doesn't know if it was actually brought to the president for his review. He says it was he felt it was communicated up the chain of command based on who was in the meeting with him, but that's a massive development. That is one of the hinge points where I think our uniformed leaders could have pushed back, or at least gone to the president and had the debate and said, "Hey, at a minimum, we need to push our security perimeter out so that we are not entirely dependent on the Taliban for secure, or the Haqqani network, i.e. terrorists, for security around this airport that's smack dab in the middle of a big urban center filled with 5 million people." But apparently General Mckenzie didn't think it was important enough that he needed to follow up and ensure that the president at least had the option available to them. I just bring that up to say I don't think it's fair to say the political decision was made, therefore we had no other options. We had to abandon Bagram. We had to focus just on this narrow security perimeter in the Kabul airport. I just, that does not hold water with me at all. And that was a very important decision point, because as General Mckenzie later admitted to me, one of the Taliban units that was providing security around the airport, the moment when 13 of our service members were killed by a suicide bomber, was this unit called Badri 313, which is the Taliban unit that specializes in suicide bombing. And I think, our original sin in this withdrawal plan was that we basically were entirely dependent on the Taliban for security around the airport, which gets to the big issue. This whole strategic failure, logistical success. The question I didn't get to ask Mckenzie is whether he thinks this was an operational success. In other words, put aside the strategy, the decision to get out, the operation to get out, that conditional surrender and corresponding non-combatant evacuation operation, whether that was a success. And I think you had all of the three gentlemen there saying, yes, our job was successfully executed. We got 124,000 people out of there. Well, a few problems with that, right? Of the 124,000, how many of those were SIVs? How do we prioritize who we got out? We're discovering significant problems with certain people that we got out and are now in places like Wisconsin, in Fort McCoy. And also just take a step back, right? Over $60 billion worth of U.S. military equipment left behind, surrendered to terrorists. Security around the airport, surrendered to terrorists. The U.S. military and the country in general humiliated in the eyes of the world. The Chinese Communist Party is exploiting our humiliation. Hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans left behind enemy lines. Tens of thousands of our Afghan allies basically left to die at the hands of the Taliban. 10 civilians slaughtered in an erroneous drone strike, a U.S. drone strike, and of course 13 American service members dead that did not need to die. How can you spin that as a success? If that's a success, well then what the hell does failure look like? I would hate to see what failure looks like. I just don't think that holds water. I think we're really going to have to dig into that. And again, the point is not to crucify someone in a public hearing, right? Or blame this or that general. It's to understand where we went wrong and the nature of our mistakes so that we don't repeat them again. And honestly, I expect our president to try and spin this and to lie to us about this, right? He's a career politician. It's in his DNA. But I don't expect that from our general officer class. I expect candor. I expect brutal honesty. And to say that this was somehow an operational or a logistical success is simply wrong. It's not honest. And the American people don't buy it. They won't accept it. And they're going to demand better.